When Flesh Becomes Steel, written and read by Elton Gar. Reroute power to the shields. Fire all weapons. Crystal, keep the ship rotating so they can't focus on a single point in our shields, Captain Lewis Harper said. He spoke loudly and firmly to make sure everyone knew that someone was in command. Without that trust, this battle was going to end poorly. Another barrage of the enemy blasts hit them. The Hornet had begun to turn, but the weapons of the alien ships were too powerful to be entirely dispersed by the shields, and a pulse of energy hit the ship, and behind him he heard one of the control panels explode. The captain turned to see that the weapons panel had broken open and pulsed with energy. Next to it, Barker stood, his cybernetic hand disabled by the same pulse. The captain rushed to the panel, but Barker put his human hand up and said, "No, Captain, it's too dangerous. I can do it." The captain looked at the man's metal hand and felt a hint of revulsion, not from the fried circuits, but from the understanding of what it was. The injuries that had led to it hadn't been Barker's fault, but it still made him less human, and now the technology had failed at the worst possible time. The Hornet's chief of security was one of the most capable men that Captain Harper had ever known. If it wasn't for the injury that had caused him to lose his hand, he'd have his own ship. But with one hand he would be slower, so the captain pushed past him. He didn't touch the panel, though. Instead he said, "Crystal, can you get me under the belly of that ship? It's got a weak spot, and if we're within 500 meters, it won't be able to target us with its main weapon." It was absurdly close. He wouldn't want to take a fighter that close to the ship, but Crystal was the best pilot he had ever seen. So she had to focus on keeping them in one piece while putting the Hornet someplace that the other ship didn't want it to be. But they had to do something. Only the pulsing of engines pushed to their limits, and the crackling of energy filled his ears. The Hornet was hit again, but this time it was a grazing blow across the top of the shields. They went down another 3%, but Crystal gave them the seconds they needed. As the enemy ship filled the entire screen, Captain Harper hoped the specs of the ship were right, because he was only going to get one chance at this. He glanced at Barker, seeing the hint of red in his cybernetic eyes, and said, "You're in command until the fight is over." It was the logical choice. The security chief had been in the fleet longer than anyone on the ship, including the captain, and had twice the combat experience, but it still felt wrong. You didn't put someone who was half machine in charge. You might as well have the ship run itself. But in combat, you did what was necessary to survive. The security chief gave him a sad smile, and the captain touched the panel, sliding the weapons to full, and then hitting the button. The surge of power shook the entire ship, and power all over the ship flickered. Even the shield went out for a moment. But as the screen flickered back on, it showed the enemy ship exploding, and the captain's world exploded with it. The already damaged weapons panel did exactly what the security chief knew would happen. It exploded, throwing the captain backwards. Captain Harper felt himself hit the wall. He heard someone say something about a fire, and then the world went black. Over the next few days, Lewis Harper went in and out of consciousness. He was mostly aware of the pain in his arm, the pain in his eye, and the throbbing on the left side of his body. But it wasn't all pain. Commander Hale, his first officer, came in and told him that the ship was safe, and only 6 people had died. But there was something odd in his voice, and he called him Lewis, not Captain. But he was too focused on losing good people and the gratitude there had been so few to think about it. As Lewis became more alert, he got small reports from the busy nurses. The ship was limping away from the front line of the war as fast as the damaged ship could. It would take a few weeks to reach the nearest shipyard for full repairs, but for now they were safe. The only other thing that he did was tell the doctor to do whatever he thought was necessary to keep him alive. Shortly after that, the pain began to recede. First, his arm went numb. The pain was gone entirely, but the feeling in it was nearly gone as well. He could tell where the fingers were, but when he reached out and gripped the metal rail at the end of the bed, there was too much missing. There was no cold feeling of the metal, no smoothness, just an understanding of the pressure. And half of his vision was gone. He had known his eye was damaged, and he could feel the bandages over his face, but everything became clear when Lieutenant Barker came in to get his hand recalibrated. It was still damaged from the panel explosion, and took more maintenance than usual. When the chief walked in, Lewis heard a small beep, and a bit of red text appeared in the blackness of his bad eye. It read, "Connection request denied. Security override disabled." That told him everything he needed to know. So, when the doctor neared him, the captain cleared his throat and said, "How much was replaced?" "I don't know exactly, but too much. You lost your left eye, your right arm, and most of your left leg. I also had to use brain interface connections because of the burns." "Then I'm a cyborg," the captain said. He understood now why people had been calling him Lewis. It wasn't nurses trying to connect to him. He wasn't the captain anymore. If he was lucky, he'd be able to retain a lieutenant rank, at least until the war ended. But every percentage of his body replaced by technology would make the laws more restrictive. He felt sick as he looked down his hand. It was pure reflective steel. The laws were clear. The prosthetics couldn't look human. It was simply too dangerous to allow them to fully integrate into society. In part because you couldn't trust them, but also because the technology gave them too many advantages. And if you didn't build in limits to the law, everyone would have to get the implants just to compete. So, while he was healing quickly and, once he had adjusted the implants, would be as capable and more capable than he was before, he wasn't legally allowed to be in command. So, he kept busy with non-command roles, mostly helping with the ship's repairs. And from time to time, he would near one of the other cyborgs. Every time, the text would appear on his screen. Sometimes it was the same, saying that it couldn't connect. Other times it asked for a password or security override. But he was beginning to understand. The brain implant automatically attempted to connect to any cybernetics it got near. It was a minor annoyance, but he didn't say anything. Outside of his light duty, Lewis spent most of his time working on rehabilitation with Lieutenant Barker. He'd likely end up in security as well, so it made sense. Then, one day, while he was practicing using his arm in combat with Barker, there was an alarm. They both began to run, but as they reached the junction, Lewis stopped. Going to the bridge could cause problems. The last thing you wanted on the bridge was two captains giving orders. But as he glanced towards the engine room, Barker said, "No time for that. You'll be more useful on the bridge, and you know it." The lieutenant was right, of course. You could never have too many people helping to run the stations on the bridge. And Lewis was better than whatever low-ranked officer would have been there for a shift when no one expected combat. Hale looked at him as he walked onto the bridge and nodded, then said, "Take the tactical station." A young woman gratefully moved away from one of the most important and most complicated stations on the bridge, and Lewis sat down. His cybernetic eye was scanning one side and distilling information, while he tried to read with the other, and he had to force the machine to the back of his mind, pretending it wasn't there to avoid the distraction. The enemy ship was small and designed to harass damaged ships behind the enemy lines. It wouldn't be much of a threat to the Hornet, but the ship was still damaged from the first battle. As the enemy ship approached them, Lewis saw the pilot begin to adjust the thrust, and he saw her mistake in that. He didn't want to say anything to the whole crew, not because it might upset Crystal, who was more than good enough not to be upset by criticism, but because Lewis knew he shouldn't be giving orders. He leaned over to Crystal and said, "You need to keep our main engines on full. They're having trouble keeping up." But as he spoke, something else happened. There was another one of the red text messages across his eyes. He glanced back to see if someone had come in, but there was no one new on the bridge. Crystal must have seen the same message because she said quietly, "Implants to speed up reaction times." That was impossible. A pilot was a command position. That made her having an implant illegal. To not outlaw it would be effectively the same as making them mandatory, and no one wanted that. But worse than that, if cyborgs replace people in positions of power, then, in a generation or two, there wouldn't be a true human left. Only people like him, he thought. And he began to wonder if he'd really been changed by the implants, or just thought he had been. But the time to consider that wasn't in the middle of combat, so he continued to study the scans and technical information the Hornet sensors were gathering. As he did, he saw Crystal return the main engine to maximum. That limited the Hornet's maneuverability, but the other ship was pushing the limits of its speed, and every time it tried to take advantage of the gap, it fell behind and took several seconds to catch up. Those seconds didn't feel long, but it gave their shields time to regenerate a few percent. And more than that, Lieutenant Barker was able to tag the enemy ship with his own shots. It was a marvel to watch, and for the first time, Lewis began to understand how the two had worked so well together. They had a network. That was one of the things that terrified humans, the ability of cyborgs to work together in ways that left the rest of humanity behind. The battle could have been in a rhythm, and would have had to have been if it was a human firing. The ship moving like a wave up and down in space, with the weapon only able to target the alien ship behind them at the crest and trough. But that rhythm would make the ship easier to hit. And with their connection allowing the two to share information faster than any human could, they didn't need the shorthand of a pattern. And it was a wonder that he hadn't seen this before. The ship's crest would be higher sometimes and lower others, and Barker never shot in those lower waves when it would be a waste of energy. After the fourth shot, Lewis used his own cybernetics to ask to join the network. It was accepted quickly, but there were no words. It's a stream of data that began to flow across the cybernetic eye. They had been doing this behind his back the entire time he had been captain. He glanced at Barker, who simply nodded, and then went back to firing. Another thing to think about later, he decided, and focused on adding the tactical information to the data stream. Most of it was on the enemy ship. The sensors could detect fluctuations in the shield harmonics. Useless information for a human, who could never react fast enough to use the information. But a cyborg could get close enough that some of their hits would do more damage. Another fraction of a percent advantage. But in combat, those made all the difference. Then he saw it. There was no time to react. No time to tell anyone. The enemy ship fired its main weapon, a much larger gun than the aft-facing guns in the Hornet, enough to do some serious damage, and too large for the enemy ship. They were forced to cycle all of their energy through the weapon to fire it. It was only a fraction of a second, and there was no real warning, but in that fraction of a second, all their defenses dropped. The data from the other two began to come in faster, and he felt his hands, both human and cyborg, flying over the keys as he worked. Even Crystal, who passed as a human, seemed to move faster than was humanly possible. Barker stopped firing as the world seemed to slow. Behind him, Lewis heard Captain hail, but he couldn't focus on that. His mind was racing too fast, trying to keep up with the others. They were losing this fight. It was slow, and they might get lucky, but this was their best chance. Then Barker fired. All 4 shots, timed the firing sequence to make it more likely they'd catch the perfect second. He saw the flicker as the enemy weapons charged. Then the enemy shields dropped. It seemed much longer this time with his brain on overdrive, and he watched the shots from the Hornet. The first 2 hit the shield. Then the third shot hit the enemy ship with the same impact as if there was no shield at all, and the enemy ship went dark as the massive power surge disabled its systems. What happened? The shields were up, Captain Hale asked from behind Lewis, his voice seeming to fade back in, and Lewis understood. He hadn't just been focused. The lieutenant had been using his mind to process power like a computer might use a secondary processor, allowing him to exceed human limitations. Their shield was fluctuating, so we timed our shots. It was 1,000 to 1, but it wasn't as if it did less damage if I didn't get lucky, the lieutenant said. He really was brilliant, and not just in tactics. He was a brilliant liar. With the immediate danger gone, Lewis stood and said, I should go. I don't want to confuse the chain of command. There is no confusion here, Captain, Hale said, and nodded at him. But, of course, he didn't know. He couldn't know, could he? Someone besides him had to have been in the dark. A few hours later, he was eating his evening meal. The red text appeared in his left eye. He found himself smiling as Barker sat next to him. No one else was nearby, so Lewis said, How many are there? On the Hornet? 4, who are passing. It's not easy to keep a secret, and there is always the risk that someone turns them in, Barker said, clearly asking the question without asking it. And why serve at all? Why work so hard to protect humans who look down on you? It had always seemed odd to Lewis, but before he had believed it was people who were just doing what they could. Now he suspected it was more. Things are changing. Not as fast as they should, but they are changing. Most people, born today, hardly remember where the laws against cybernetics were written. They don't have the same fear of being replaced that their grandparents did. It's just not enough, Lewis said. Not for everyone. That's why there are protests and strikes every few months. But for me, it has to be enough. Hope that things will get better is what I have. Lewis looked into the coffee for a few seconds, and then said, Do you think the captain will let me stay? I think I can do some good here. I hope so, Barker said. Author's note. When I came up with this idea, I was flooded with the potential for metaphors. It could be about ableism and people's dislike of seeing sick people, or ageism, as people have more implants as they get older, and there are many others. The problem is that in short stories you can't have 15 metaphors and serve any of them. That said, I do think that I touched on a few of them. The difficulty of dealing with a change in your life based on being injured is one that I know people face, and I hope that I portrayed the difficulties of that without making it feel like it was justified. I have had a taste of that myself, though it is different when something you know will end eventually rather than a permanent life change. And of course there is simple bigotry. I touched on replacement theory because I think, as irrational things go, it's one that sounds marginally more rational, especially when it's wrapped up with fear of change and new technologies that allow things to change faster than ever before. But it is my hope that the same technologies that allowed the spreading of that fear in our world will also allow us to bend the moral arc just a bit more in the right direction. Let's call it speedrunning the whole cycle. It makes the bad parts come faster and possibly even be worse. But hopefully it also speeds up the process of revealing it for what it is. Because, while seeing the worst parts of us is nothing anyone wants, sunlight is still the best disinfectant. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to have some say in what I write next, you can join my Patreon for free and vote on what my monthly theme is. This month's theme is It Isn't What It Looks Like, which focuses on masks, costumes, and deception about who you are. Paid patrons also get access to a weekly poll on what story I write next, as well as over 50 patron-exclusive short stories. Thank you, Elton Gar.